Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is The Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, it falls again on the coaching staff.
Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. I mean, you need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
You know, when you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready?
Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It is another edition of the Cameron Parker Show, and we are kicking it off, as always, with a fellow compadre, fellow writer. Used to be a writer, now he's the host over at Locked On Broncos, and it's Cody Rourke. How you doing, my man?
You know what, Cameron? I'm doing very good today, man. I had some Texas Roadhouse, some good ribs, watching some college football, USC versus Ohio State, man, and obviously joining you here on the Cameron Parker Show. Thanks for having me.
First, it is a huge question. Was it the full rack? Was it a half rack? That's a huge decision.
That's a huge commitment, man. The full rack is a lot of commitment. I went with the half rack because
you wuss.
Know what? It's the new year, man. I got to get my form, my body right, especially as I start kicking off, obviously, a new workout regimen, man. But, yeah, the half rack was just as satisfying. So, yeah, man. Tempting, though. One of these, maybe for my birthday, I'll go full rack.
Well, that's very fitting for you to go full rack. I mean, right? I mean, on your birthday? All right,
that's
man.
On Friday, man.
All right, man. Well, we are going to be doing, as always, whenever I have, you or Mario Vitanzi, who was on last week. If you guys haven't had an opportunity to listen to that show, go back and listen to it on iTunes, iHeartRadio. Subscribe to the Cameron Parker Show podcast on iTunes. You can also follow the show on Spreaker. Comment on the chat line. We also have what you would call a text line, so you guys can comment on the chat line. I'll be planning on doing a Periscope broadcast here soon. But yeah, so we're going to be talking Denver Broncos like we did with Mario, but we're going to get it from also a different point of view, and that would be of the coach's perspective, shall I say, Cody?
Yeah, absolutely. Been coaching football for 8 years at the high school level. Football's always kind of been a big thing for me in my whole life. Growing up, I played football at a very high level for about 15 years, retired after I suffered an ACL tear. But definitely love it, man. Definitely brings a different side to it. I look at the game a lot differently than a lot of people, and that's definitely something I feel like should definitely bring a lot of good perspective to, obviously, the listeners out there. And I know there's probably a lot of listeners out there that maybe even coach football themselves or study the game from an analytical point of view the same way I do. So it just brings a different perspective when you can look at the X and O side of things, especially with all the hot topics that we have regarding the Denver Broncos. That's
a fact. I mean, you think of where the Broncos were in the beginning part of the year as far as a team that people coined as could be a better football team than the 9-7. Some people were smart, and us probably, kind of threw it by the wayside. But really, the team was in a rebuilding, or I don't even know what you want to call it, a downward spiral is probably the best way to put it. But the team really, at least on the surface and on paper, as we like to use that phraseology, on paper it certainly seemed as if the Broncos were going to be a divisional winner, playoff contender, and once they made it to the playoffs, well, it could have been a different animal. It didn't work out the way. It started out fine, 7-1, really, in their first 8 games, if you want to count the preseason, because being 4-0, I guess, matters to some people. But the Broncos were 3-1, and then, well, all hell broke loose. They lost 8 games in a row. Trevor Siemian was the starting quarterback, then inserted by Brock Osweiler, then inserted Paxton Lynch, back to Brock Osweiler, and then back to Trevor Siemian, and then back to Brock Osweiler, and then back to Paxton Lynch. So here it goes one more time again of the quarterback carousel. We'll just start off with a bang because it is the topic of a lot of discussion. It is the quarterback carousel. The best, and I was saying it through the message feed that we have with a lot of the cohorts of Predominantly Orange. I still firmly believe, and it doesn't really matter that Paxton Lynch may or may not be the guy, but I still believe as far as the cheapest option, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen, but I still think that the best case scenario would be to see what they have in Paxton Lynch, and they're at least going to hope and pray that they get a full look of him on Sunday.
I really don't know if the Broncos can really get a true good look for what Paxton Lynch is going to bring to the table in this one game on Week 17, especially against the Kansas City Chiefs team, who's probably going to be sitting out a lot of their key starters, are going to get a lot of young guys, some reps. But I think when we look at Paxton Lynch, especially even last year, 2016, where he had the 2 starts, one against Jacksonville, arguably one of the best secondaries in the National Football League. They're good this year. They're much better this year, but they were pretty good last year. He didn't have a lot of success against them. Obviously struggled against the Atlanta Falcons, who went on to the Super Bowl, and fell to the New England Patriots. And then we saw him this year against Oakland, and he didn't look too sharp. He didn't look too sharp at all. He held on to the ball a little too much, and that's the thing. And just 3 starts for Paxton Lynch. I think the statistic that really wears on me, it could be a combination of the offensive line or obviously holding on to the ball too long, but being sacked 13 times in 3 starts is not a very good statistic for any kind of quarterback in the National Football League. So that's a lot of sacks if you go and think about it. 3 games, 13 sacks that you've suffered from, and obviously haven't thrown a lot of touchdowns, thrown a few interceptions, and that's the hard part. And you really just want to look at Paxton Lynch, and he's a guy I think that really cares. He's very emotional. A lot of people knocked him on the sideline when he was showing some emotion on the sideline against the Raiders. I've never understood why people do that. Especially when we're seeing a guy who has probably worked his whole entire life to get to where he's at in the National Football League, to obviously go play Division I football down there at Memphis, and obviously come here and obviously get an opportunity, and then you get hurt. That's just something that we look at, and I just think it's very distasteful. Now, I like Paxton Lynch a lot. I think he's a great player. I actually had him in my mock draft. Now, when I was working with Kennard over there on Twitter, we did a mock draft, and I picked that the Broncos would move up and pick up Paxton Lynch because guess what? Peyton Manning retired. You had this unknown guy on your roster named Trevor Siemian you don't really know anything about. Brock Osweiler left to Houston. And so at this point, you're like, okay, well, I think he's the most electric guy right now that the Denver Broncos can go and get. And so they did. And unfortunately, the expectations that we've had regarding Paxton Lynch have not been met yet. And obviously the whole point that I think a lot of people look at is training camp. The quarterback competition 2017, 104.3 The Fan. They did a very good job at that, making that a big issue. The biggest thing was it just made this summer dreadful as a Broncos fan. Somebody who covered the Broncos, just waiting for the quarterback battle to get over with, to figure out who's going to be the guy. This guy was pulling ahead, or this guy had a better day. It was just frustrating, and it's draining, and I don't think I can survive another summer of any quarterback controversy, so I'm hoping our prayers are answered a little bit, and we figure out who's going to be our 16-game quarterback heading into next season, probably towards the end of March. That's my hope, and it's my prayer. We'll definitely have to see how free agency or the draft play out, but definitely rooting for Paxton Lynch, though, this Sunday to showcase what he has against the Kansas City Chiefs. Their defense, overall, they've gotten a lot better over the last couple of weeks, but like I said, they've been prone to giving up the big play over and over and over again this year. And I think that's actually what's going to, undo them in the first round of the playoffs. And, I think you said it best, too. When, one thing we were dealing with this week is we saw the article from a Kansas City Chiefs blog talking about how Kansas City Chiefs fans should appreciate how bad the Broncos are right now. I just don't know what inspired that, but I'm going to be the bigger person here and say, you know what, as a Broncos fan, if the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, if they got to the playoffs, I would cheer them on because they're the AFC West, and you want to have that kind of success within your conference. It's something you hang your hat on, and I'm sure some Chiefs fans did the same thing when the Broncos won it in 2015, especially going up against the Panthers. And I don't know, sports continues to make me scratch my head a little bit, Cameron, and I think overall I'm just excited, but I'm also very sad that this week is the last week of Broncos football. I really don't know how to feel about it.
Well, it's you touched on a lot of things there, and I think that first starting with Paxton Lynch, you think of the situation that he's been dealt with and the offense that he's running. I don't actually have the actual stats in front of me of how many times he's been under center, and I brought it up with Mario last week. But I don't know if the Broncos themselves are in, and I guess I just don't even know their thought process, but I feel like they really do not know or who Paxton Lynch is, or they are just trying to tie themselves up so that they want to make sure that Paxton Lynch doesn't succeed. And what I mean by that is how many times he's been under center. It's been really manila. And you think about Paxton Lynch and the offense that he ran at Memphis, it was predominantly shotgun. It was short passes. It was intermediate passes to get to the playmakers outside and to really get to your best players. But that's not been the case at all when Paxton Lynch has it's been horrendous. Let's be honest. It's been absolutely horrendous when he's been in the game. But at least help the kid out. You know what I mean? And obviously there's been no continuity, and maybe that's just been the case during the training camp, and where Paxton Lynch just is not there mentally still, which is a huge problem. And it's probably why that the Broncos could potentially move on from, it isn't just Paxton Lynch, but they could just move on from Paxton Lynch, Brock Osweiler, and Trevor Siemian. Brock Osweiler for the same matter that happened in 2015, where they're going to end up overpaying for Brock, maybe not to the same extent that they did the last time, but they're going to end up overpaying for Brock Osweiler and making him the starter next year, which isn't a bad option. I mean, he played okay, but he's not the end-all, beat-all. Never has been, ever since he left Denver. And then you go into this topic of, the Kansas City topic. I've always felt this problem with SB Nation overall. I'm not the biggest fan of that brand. And sending hateful stuff like that as far as an article, it rubs people the wrong way. And people, yes, I am a Denver Broncos fan, but you think about it, you and I have said it best at the times when you were at Predominantly Orange. You're a blog site. Yes, blog sites consist of opinions, but also blogs are a journalistic value. You are a journalist, and people go to your sites to read your material, hoping that it's good. Is it clickbait? Yes. Was the article clickbait? Absolutely. But there's that fine line of journalistic integrity that you do not write an article like that just to poke a bull when literally the bull is down and stabbed in the throat. And right now this season the Broncos are down and stabbed in the throat based on how that season is going. But I think overall you're looking at this scenario for the quarterback situation that it hasn't, you touched on it best, the season has spiraled to the point where the quarterback situation hasn't really been handled all that well going into this season and even going into the last season. And so I think that it's important, whether what happens with Vance Joseph or not, it's important that the Broncos find that fine line of who will that quarterback be. Will it be Eli Manning? Will it be a Kirk Cousins? Or will it be maybe the cheapest option? And that's not a dig on draft picks, but draft picks are always sometimes the cheapest option. Is it that they need to go after a guy like a Baker Mayfield with the 9th overall pick, or go all bananas like Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs and trade up and get it and maybe get the best guy and get a Josh Rosen or a Sam Darnold?
I think the Broncos certainly have to look at all those options pertaining to it. I think the best move is, we've seen that Brock Osweiler has proved that he is a backup quarterback in the NFL, and I think he's probably the more reliable backup quarterback in the NFL, where you feel a little more comfort. If your starter goes down, okay, well, Brock Osweiler can come in and he'll do okay. He'll do better than probably what most people would do. Now, on the other hand, I think the Denver Broncos look at some of these prospects. I think, obviously, Darnold out of USC, I think Mayfield, I think Kirk Cousins. These are guys you have to obviously pursue. I don't think Eli Manning is going to be gone after the Giants hired their general manager today. He has a lot of faith in Eli Manning, especially after how Eli Manning performed against the Philadelphia Eagles. I think that's a big key point in keeping Eli down there in New York. And Drew Brees, he's not going to leave New Orleans now with Alvin Kamara and how successful they've been this season. They finally have a team around him that can take the pressure off Drew Brees. Kirk Cousins, in my opinion, is the one veteran guy out there. Unless you go for a Teddy Bridgewater or a Case Keenum, which I can't imagine the Vikings letting Case Keenum go like that. But Sam Bradford's an option. And I think you look at some of those options, you have to have a guy who's a veteran who has experience in the National Football League that can come in, and you still draft a quarterback with your first-round pick. And what you look at in that situation is you look at a guy who's going to sit behind this guy for a few years, develop, learn, and when his time comes, he's going to be out there and he's going to be ready to lead the team. I think that's the hard thing that not a lot of people really look at regarding the National Football League. So, I think for the most part, when we think about the Broncos quarterback situation, I don't think John Elway is going into another year in 2018 with a mindset that, I don't know who our quarterback's going to be. I think that was too much of a circus enough. It was a distraction, in my opinion, for the team all offseason during training camp. That was the only thing people talked about, the quarterback position. NFL Network, the quarterback position, ESPN Radio, the quarterback position. While you have the other side of things where you have Domata Peko as a Denver Bronco, a guy who's a veteran who's going to be bringing a leadership role to the Broncos. Nobody talked about that, but his play has spoken for itself this year. Just areas, a lot of areas that kind of went unnoticed in the offseason. Obviously, some rookie guys. Jamal Carter was a guy who was a big name for the Denver Broncos. This, obviously in preseason and during the offseason in training camp. DeMonte Thomas, a guy who nobody really knows about besides preseason, having the pick six and being called up to the active roster. And you just got all these different areas. I think that the Denver Broncos just need to kind of figure out. And the main areas, in my opinion, that the Broncos have to address, obviously quarterback, but the next up, offensive line. You have to figure out a right tackle. You can't have a Menelik Watson or a Donald Stevenson that's your right tackle, or even Alan Barber going forward. You have to find a solidified right tackle through free agency or trade, or you draft a guy that's gritty, big, and mean, opposite of Garrett Bowles, and I think that helps. I don't think the Broncos' offensive line is as bad as it looks often at times. I think that's the important thing we have to really consider here. Garrett Bowles, sometimes with the Broncos quarterbacks holding the ball too long, well, guess what? Which left tackle in the NFL, especially in the AFC West, isn't going to hold a pass rusher if the play's going on for more than 4 seconds? Now, I think Garrett Bowles has had a rough rookie introduction, but he's also had a lot of upside too. And I don't think a lot of people really see that. Now, left guard is an absolute wreck. I think you have to move Ron Leary back to his natural spot at left guard next season. You keep Matt Paradise at center. And then you obviously, I think Connor McGovern, or if the Broncos want to move away from Matt Paradise, you have Connor McGovern at center. Then you have to figure out right guard, which puts a monkey wrench in everything. But if Paradise stays, you keep Connor McGovern at right guard, and then that's where you find your right tackle. I don't know who the options are. I don't know what options are currently out there yet that the Denver Broncos can utilize. However, they have to address, obviously, quarterback, offensive line, and obviously, in my opinion, this may be the most unpopular take or opinion in Denver sports, but you have to find a new head coach, in my honest opinion. Definitely controversial, but I just think the lack of experience on the coaching staff all around. I'd say the most experienced coach right now that's on the roster in a key position is offensive coordinator Bill Musgrave. Now, I envision Bill Musgrave being back with the Broncos next year regardless of who the head coach is. I just think that Vance Joseph is not a head coach. He's not ready to be a head coach in the National Football League just yet, especially after only having 1 year as a defensive coordinator in Miami, where they actually had one of the worst defenses in the National Football League. So there's just a lot of things that I can pinpoint on the season that I think have been catalysts to why the Denver Broncos spiraled out of control. And Steven joined me here for an episode of Locked On Broncos today, and we were talking about Vance Joseph, and we were thinking about it. You have this guy in Vance Joseph coming into this locker room, a locker room of champions, a locker room that went 9-7 last year with Gary Kubiak, essentially the same roster, went 9-7. This year, they're probably going to finish 5-10, or at best, I think, what is it? It's either
5-11, 6-10,
5-11, or 6-10 at best. But sitting at 5-10 right now, if they lose, they'll be 5-11. You just have to. You got this guy, Vance Joseph, and this is just my gripe, and I don't know if anybody shares the same sentiment as I do, but when something goes wrong and the camera pans Vance Joseph, I always see his arms crossed, and to me, that doesn't show faith. It doesn't show me confidence in him as a coach, because when things go wrong, you have to find a way to address it. Now, anytime something wrong happened with the Denver Broncos on defense, I always seen the camera pan to Wade Phillips, and Wade Phillips was fixing it right away. He was jumping. He was energetic. I look at Sean McVay, the success he's having in Los Angeles. He's a passionate coach. Doug Peterson out there in Philadelphia, he's a passionate coach. Mike Zimmer down there in Minnesota, he's having a lot of fun with these guys this year. He's a passionate coach, and you got to show that. And you also got to choose some grown men out when they're not doing their job. And my case point that really drove this theory in for me was when Isaiah McKenzie caught the curl route. No timeouts left for the Denver Broncos against the Redskins. Caught the curl route. Instead of getting out of bounds, he runs inside, gets tackled, time runs out, no opportunity for a field goal. And at that point, Isaiah McKenzie comes off, and Vance Joseph doesn't rip him. He just kind of mouths or whispers, "What are you doing?" I'm sorry. When I played football, I got it a lot worse than "What are you doing?" It was a lot worse. I can't probably say it here on air, but that's my point. You don't have a coach that is going to challenge guys. Now, Vance Joseph came in this offseason as the supposed leader of men, and I haven't seen it unless we're talking about a leader of men who leads them to defeat. I don't know, but the Denver Broncos really fell off after the bye week, and I've never seen anything like it. It was a total collapse, total spiral. The train came off the tracks for the Denver Broncos and didn't make any sense, especially as the Broncos headed into the bye week. 3-1, defeated the Cowboys, looked mediocre against the Buffalo Bills, and snuck out a win against the Raiders late with obviously an athletic play by Justin Simmons to pick off E.J. Manuel on Amari Cooper. He picked him off, high pointed the ball in the air, and at that point, the Broncos headed into the bye week pretty confident. I don't know what happened. You have 2 weeks off to prepare for the winless New York Giants, and they just came out, and nothing happened. From the very beginning, the Broncos came out with no energy. They came out like a team that was thinking they were just going to walk over the New York Giants, who currently had no wide receivers on their roster. Every single wide receiver hit injured reserve, and you had Eli Manning banged up. And the defense for the Denver Broncos struggled to stop the run with Orleans Darkwa. He ran all over the Denver Broncos, gave up over 100 yards rushing. So there's just a lot of issues. My biggest issue is that when I watch the Broncos this year, they haven't been competitive in any way, shape, or form. It would be a different story if they were in a 7-3 or a 10-7 game and lost, compared to obviously 27-11 loss or a 51-17 loss. It's just stuff like that I really can't accept as a Broncos fan.
You touched on a lot of things there.
Oh man!
But it's hard not to with the disappointing season that they had. The Kirk Cousins thing is interesting because you think of all the quarterback situations and the quarterback Andre that John Elway's going to end up seeing himself with. He is going to have to find this middle ground of, do we want to go for a Kirk Cousins quarterback that is in his late 20s, but it's also in the late 20s to the point where it also gives a establishment to the quarterback position for more years than just one or half a season for that matter, and that's the important thing. And I want to talk about this point with Kirk Cousins that that I guess that doesn't get all that talked about much. I didn't get to talk about it a whole lot when Mario was on there, but I don't think, and this is going to end up happening, obviously, if Kirk Cousins signs here, that people are going to start rattling off different opinions about, the fit and everything like that. There's a point necessarily that I think that not many people are starting to realize with Kirk Cousins and I think that this is why maybe teams like Jacksonville and Denver would be appealing to a team like or a quarterback necessarily like Kirk Cousins, because of what he, and I'll say it like this, grew up with in college. When he was at Michigan State, he had a very solid running game. Remember that running back by chance? It was Le'Veon Bell. Le'Veon Bell was the running back over at Michigan State. And oh, by the way, they had a top 5 defense in college football. So Kirk Cousins has shown the propensity to play with a great defense. And I think as far as Jacksonville is concerned, who is the one team probably right now that's in playoff contention that is in dire need of a quarterback situation or a quarterback upgrade, maybe still. It still probably would be Jacksonville, although I think probably right now best bet would be to stick with Blake Bortles. It's a different take entirely. But you look at it with Denver, their defense, and it's certainly a gray area right now with the salary situation and with as horrendous as the season has been, because it's now going to put them in a spot for Kirk Cousins that will, well, force the no-fly zone and force the biggest strong suit of the team and force the defense as a whole to be gutted by about two or three players. And you're looking at players potentially like Derek Wolfe, who has dealt with numerous injuries, that could potentially be either a release or, in a surprising move, retire because of the amount of injuries that he's had. Then you go to Aqib Talib. Aqib Talib is one of the best corners, if not the best corner, on the Denver Broncos, and with the amount of salary that he's generating, he could potentially be a release. And that would free up a good amount of money. And then the other one would end up being Brandon Marshall, the linebacker, no relation to the wide receiver, Brandon Marshall, that so many people have a tendency to mess up every now and then on Twitter. I don't know how that happens, by the way. It's a separate point entirely. But anyway, so you look at that situation, and maybe you kind of say, well, we want to at least keep one player, one solidified player that could have been on the move, and keep him, and then maybe look on the offensive side of the ball and maybe say, well, Emmanuel Sanders, do you want to take a pay cut? We know that Emmanuel Sanders, more than likely, those are the words he never wants to hear, and Emmanuel Sanders could potentially be a potential release, or likely release, if that happens, for a pay cut. So there's and C.J. Anderson potentially with 1 year left on his contract, and knowing the Broncos with the amount of season that they've had, they do want to turn to Devontae Booker potentially as the future. But herein lies the problem, I think, and you touched on it, and I kind of fed off of it a little bit. I think as far as the biggest identifier, and there's a lot of them with the head coaching problems potentially that has unfolded with Vance Joseph over the course of the season, and the decisions that he's made, and Isaiah McKenzie being active, and D'Angelo Henderson not being active. As far as Vance Joseph is concerned, the biggest point I think that could be his downfall as far as a head coach has been, dare I say, a lot like John Fox. Remember when John Fox was so inept into playing rookies? How many players on the draft class for the Broncos have contributed in the draft class? Garrett Bowles, Isaiah McKenzie, DeMarcus Walker, who they can't even get his position right. So I think for the Broncos, and especially with Vance Joseph, what is going on? I mean, there has to be that point of emphasis, and it should have happened early on, that they wanted to commit to a draft class. And then the other point of emphasis that could end up being his downfall is how he handled the whole Jamal Charles scenario. Look, C.J. Anderson has had a terrific year. He's going to end up probably getting the 1,000-yard mark, potentially in that Kansas City game. And I'm not the only one saying it. Cody's been saying it. Steven's been saying it. A lot of Broncos fans have been saying it. Jamal Charles is still one of the most athletic running backs on that Denver Broncos roster, and probably the best running back on that roster, and they aren't even using him. And so for that is the potential downfall, I think, of Vance Joseph, is the handling of Isaiah McKenzie, the handling of Jamal Charles probably more than anyone. Just because every single time Jamal Charles has touched the football, he's done something with it. And look, I realize putting someone in the doghouse for fumbling a football, I mean, I understand that logic, but the dude fumbled once. And you're going to put him in the doghouse because, he fumbled, and he's also a veteran, which doesn't even make a lick of sense. He's a potential Hall of Famer. He's potentially the biggest play running back in the history of the National Football League, and you're going to put him in the doghouse? That just shows a lot of inexperience. And to that matter, here's a point of why I think the game has been a little bit slow for Vance Joseph. Remember the game about, 3 weeks ago, when Vance Joseph was talking and he said, there's that delay of game penalty? Oh, no, I don't remember that.
Yeah, against Miami on the kickoff.
That offsides. I said delay game. It was the offsides against. No, we had an offsides on the kickoff. No, I don't remember that. It's just a little small stuff like that also could end up being big stuff. And I realized that, Elway came out and he said that, or not really said, but the expectation that was leaked that he was going to end up being retained. I don't see how at this point, if the Broncos lose to Kansas City, and you look at the whole season, and typically I always side on the caution of you want to see more from a first-year head coach. I don't know about you, but I always want to show more confidence in a first-year head coach. But after what's unraveled and the blowout losses of nearly 20 to 30 points, and the amount of games that has happened, you have to look at that and the amount of preparation that's unfolded, because the preparation that they had with Peyton Manning and the preparation that they've had with Vance Joseph is night and day.
It's still hard. It's super hard for me, honestly. Like you said, you want to have some confidence in your first-year head coach, but I don't see a lot of confidence just in the persona of Vance Joseph and who he is as a coach. I watch his press conferences, and I see no confidence whatsoever. We had a great week of practice. How many times have we heard that?
And then what happened on that Sunday?
Blowout.
Right.
Blowout loss.
Yeah.
I want to hear about, we didn't have a good practice today. We got to come out tomorrow and come out a lot better. Stuff like that maybe might turn the tide a little bit, but they ask Vance Joseph, well, how did Paxton look? He looks tall. He looked tall today.
How's Brock? He's tall.
He's tall. How does Paxton look today? He threw the ball well. Well, I'd hope he'd throw the ball well. He's an NFL quarterback. You hope he can throw the ball well. So it's just a lot of those statements that rub me the wrong way, especially as a football coach. I don't really sugarcoat it in any way, shape, or form. I call a player what it is, what their playing style is, what they look like. If their mechanics aren't there, then I say that. If they're lazy, I call them. I say that, well, your effort is lazy. Vance Joseph, in my opinion, I feel like it's just a big puppet. Now, I figured this was my theory. I felt like Vance Joseph was hired on the grounds of being a yes man to John Elway, but I've heard some things that Vance Joseph technically stopped listening to John Elway, start doing his things his own way. Now, I look back at how Vance Joseph was at Miami as a defensive coordinator. 27th ranked defense in the National Football League for a first-year D coordinator, a guy who used to coach DBs. My biggest issue with Vance Joseph this year is how he has hindered the Denver Broncos defense, and the reason I think that is because he's the head coach. And at the end of the day, he has the say on what the coordinators, what the offense, what the defense need to do with the team. And Vance Joseph made it a key emphasis that, well, we need to add more zone defense to it. Well, the zone defense with the Denver Broncos right now reminds me a lot of 2014 under Jack Del Rio. 4-man blitzes, 3-man blitzes, and a zone defense where you're supposed to cover. where you go against good NFL quarterbacks like the young Carson Wentz, obviously Drew Brees or Tom Brady or Alex Smith. When you run a zone defense, there are so many open holes, especially with speedy wide receiver threats out of the slot that they have in the NFL this year, including T.Y. Hilton, Tyreek Hill being a guy, Josh Dotson, Jamison Crowder, guys like that have eaten the Denver Broncos up because of zone defense. Now, the Denver Broncos went man-to-man coverage against the Redskins in the first half, and they had success against Kirk Cousins and the speedy wide receivers in the run game, Samaje Perine. And then, obviously, the second half, you went to the zone defense. Well, guess what? Kirk Cousins recognized what zone coverage they were in, and it was dicing the open coverages in the open zones. And that's the biggest issue to me with Vance Joseph, is that you have a championship caliber defense, and a lot of this is going to fall on Joe Woods being, having the title of a defensive coordinator. But overall, the Broncos, just think about how this entire season has gone, Cameron. To think that the Denver Broncos have a chance on Sunday to finish as the number one defense in the National Football League, it blows my mind. I don't get it. This whole season has been weird. It's been unexpected, but to have a chance to finish as the number one ranked defense in the National Football League,
And be 5-11.
Crazy. At 5-11, it's unbelievable.
And so then let me ask you this, because I was talking about it earlier. Where's the fine line? And I think that this is why maybe even looking at the draft, it could end up being the best option for the Broncos when it comes to a quarterback position. Because we know that it all starts and ends with the quarterback position. It's a quarterback-driven league. But my point is that, where's the go-between? Because, you think about it, you said that the Denver Broncos had the opportunity to finish first as far as in total defense. Do you really want to break that up? And if you do, is it fair to that defense to do that?
I really don't think it is fair to your defense, because let's take a look at this too. You have Von Miller, you have Shaquille Barrett, Shane Ray, Akeem Cleve, Chris Harris Jr., Darian Stewart, Justin Simmons, Will Parks, Brandon Marshall, Domata Peko on the interior, Derek Wolfe obviously is another guy, but you have a lot of key centerpiece players for this Broncos defense. Let's not forget, this Denver Broncos defense for the first couple weeks of the NFL season were dominating the Chargers. Were dominating the Dallas Cowboys, who had Ezekiel Elliott, Des Bryant. They had a fully healthy team, so there was no excuse. And they beat them. They beat them down drastically. The Denver Broncos defense was top 5 in passing, obviously, and obviously number 1 at one point in stopping the run. And I just think that given everything, you don't want to break that up. Now you have to really focus and try to figure out. Some guys are going to have to take a pay cut. Now, Demaryius Thomas may be asked to take a pay cut. Von Miller may be asked to take a pay cut and divvy it up into a bonus of somehow the money that they're going to ask him to kind of restructure. Aqib Talib, in my opinion, from what I've heard, wants to stay in Denver, and I think he's willing to take a pay cut. How much? I'm not sure. How much are they going to ask? I'm not sure. But you got to try to keep this team together. Chris Harris Jr. had this very sobering quote this week, and it kind of made me depressed. I kind of just said I want to ignore it, but he said something along the lines of, this may be the last time you see the no-fly zone intact. And that, to be honest with you, I don't like how that sounds. It doesn't make me feel very well. But I know that Chris Harris Jr. is phenomenal. He's locked in with the Broncos. Bradley Roby's locked in with the Broncos. Just having Aqib Talib out there, he just brings this swagger, this energy, this passion, that if you're going against him, you hate him. But if he's on your team, you absolutely love him because he gets under your skin. And he's a bona fide pound-for-pound best cornerback in the National Football League. He's right now holds the most. He's number 1 in the NFL amongst active players and pick sixes. That's unbelievable. Over 10 pick sixes. How many of those have been for the Broncos? That's the key stat. He's had a lot of pick sixes as a Denver Bronco, and I tell you what, I would take Aqib Talib 10 times over. I would take him if I had to walk through an alley in a bar fight. Guess what? Aqib Talib, you're coming with me.
Don't forget a gun. Don't forget.
Hey, you know what? That was just a miscue. But, I just don't think the Denver Broncos should gut this defense just to get one guy, just to get a quarterback. You got to find ways to make it work. And if I know anything about John Elway, he's a business guy. Look who constructed this defense. John Elway. John Elway constructed this defense. I don't think he's going to gut it just to get a quarterback. I think he's
2014
gonna find some
offseason.
other ways. I really do.
I was going to say 2014 offseason. They were obliterated by the Seattle Seahawks. And I think about it, this is going to end up being probably the most important offseason after what went down after the 2013 Super Bowl, where the team landed T.J. Ward, and they landed DeMarcus Ware, Aqib Talib, and Emmanuel Sanders. So it's basically entering that point where, for the Broncos, they have a lot of key decisions. And let's go to the draft for a little bit, because, maybe that is the best alternative. And, we're watching potentially quarterback, and they're getting obliterated right now by Ohio State, 17-0. But that's more than likely not going to knock the potential draft stock, potentially, of Sam Darnold. But Sam Darnold, by all accounts, me, is probably the number one quarterback right now. I was a Josh Rosen guy early on, but I'm not entirely sure how that personality would work, especially with the team, the way that it's constructed. And but then again, here I am, and I like the talent and swagger that Baker Mayfield possesses. So it's but I think that Baker Mayfield plays a little bit more controlled at times. And, you start to hear things that he's actually a really good guy, on and off the field from what D.D. Westbrook was describing. And so let's get to the draft, because I think it's very possible, whether it's Kirk Cousins or bust, and everything that we've heard is that the Kirk Cousins that I've heard and that you've heard is that Kirk Cousins is the top priority. It certainly appears that I think it would be a good possibility that, what if the Broncos decide to go offensive line with back-to-back picks, or for that matter, go to a very, very under-the-radar position of need, and this is if they decide to not retain Todd Davis. What if they decide to go get this guy, Roquan Smith, from Georgia, that middle linebacker, or just an instinctful linebacker, or a Josie Jewell in the second or third round. A guy that is instinctual, plays like Luke Kuechly. I tell you right now, Josie Jewell is a guy that I can tout for days. He looks like a cheap man version of Zach Thomas, Luke Kuechly, all rolled into one body. The guy just has got it as far as instincts, and same with Roquan Smith. So I think the middle linebacker spot, or just a linebacker spot in general, is
Give me Roquan Smith, man. I tell you, I like that guy. He's a big, phenomenal freak. We get to see him in action, obviously, at the Rose Bowl. I'm excited about it. He's a guy, in my honest opinion, Cameron, that can be a game changer in the National Football League. I think he compares best to a guy like Navarro Bowman, just for the ability to cover a lot quicker. He's ruthless in the run. He's a big guy. He's a huge.
Have you seen his closing speed?
Defense. He's a huge reason why Georgia's defense is top 4 in obviously college football. So that's definitely a guy I would like to have.
And I think of it. I actually compared him to a former Nebraska linebacker that I love, and oh, by the way, could have been a Denver Bronco if Brock Osweiler was not taken a pick ahead of him. Levante David. I think Roquan Smith reminds me so much of Levante David. He's incredibly instinctual. The closing speed is phenomenal for Roquan Smith and Levante David. And I think that the football IQ, it just appears like that is just off the charts, incredible. And when you have the opportunity to get a guy like that, that can change the landscape of your defense entirely. And we're talking about a defense that could finish, first overall. And if there's one position entirely, that has been maybe the biggest weakness or the weakest link of that Denver Broncos defense, it's been linebacker. And Brandon Marshall certainly has shown his ineptitude. His struggles, in the season as far as covering a running back or covering a tight end. But we saw in 2015 how two of the same guys that are versatile enough to play the same position or different positions can work well together. Danny Trevathan and Brandon Marshall were on the field for the first time. For the first time together for a full season, and they were unreal. It led to the best defense in NFL history. So I think that, getting a guy like a Roquan Smith would be incredibly beneficial. And everything that I've heard, is that they love that kid. But, I also don't think, and this is my O.J. Howard crush. You ready, Cody? Is that if you if you have the opportunity to just magically land Saquon Barkley, and I know that they love Devontae Booker, but man, and you just magically get Kirk Cousins, just the offensive dynamic between Kirk Cousins and Saquon Barkley just makes me think of the time when he literally was in Michigan State when he had Kirk Cousins and Le'Veon Bell. I don't know. That just kind of makes me salivate just thinking about it.
Hey, on paper, it's a very dynamic duel. If you look at it, I certainly the most intriguing prospect in my opinion. He's a phenomenal tailback, man. I tell you what, I haven't seen a guy that's as physical as he is, but as elusive as he is. He's if I had to compare him between two guys, he's got some Jamal Charles ability, but obviously with some Le'Veon Bell-ish type stuff. I think he is a Le'Veon Bell. I shouldn't even compare him to anybody on our roster. He's a Le'Veon Bell type player. And I tell you what, I haven't seen a player like him play the tailback position in a few years, especially in the National Football League. It's just I look at the Denver Broncos and not a lot of people are sold on Devontae Booker being the future back for the Denver Broncos. Completely a big thing was questioning his toughness, and that's the Miami game where he had the stomach bug and he had the bubble guts, and he decided to sit out the second half. And Ryan Harris, former Denver Broncos tackle, really went at him on air about it, especially about the fact that, look, you know what, you wasted a roster spot that day when somebody else could have put that jersey on that would have played through it. I don't know.
There's a running back that could have used that.
Absolutely. And why not D'Angelo Henderson at that point? And that's another guy. The Broncos picked him up out of Coastal Carolina in the offseason in the draft, and he hasn't really played this. He hasn't played this year. He had one pass attempt thrown his way last week and only one carry, and that's just not good enough. You're not going to use Jamal Charles. Well, C.J. Anderson, in my opinion, I like the guy. He's a nice guy. He gets into arguments with fans on Twitter. I don't like that about him, but he's 54 yards away from 1,000. But C.J. Anderson, despite all that, really he doesn't hit the hole hard enough. He doesn't have that. Now, Henderson, he's just as energizer bunny, and that's why Jamal Charles being criminally underutilized by the Denver Broncos, in my opinion, I think that's what's hurt the Broncos. They went with more of a guy who averaged maybe 2.3 to 3 yards a carry, and C.J. Anderson, and he hasn't really had an opportunity to really bounce anything. He's early on in the season, he ran very hard and sprung some big runs, but overall he's been average, in the 8-game slide that the Denver Broncos, ensued after the bye week. And, Jamal Charles rips off an 18-yard run against the Kansas City Chiefs on Monday Night Football. His next play, he runs a 9-yard run, fumbles the ball. Marcus Peters picks it up for a touchdown. And at that point, bye-bye Jamal Charles. You don't get to play anymore. And to me, I felt like that's where I lost a lot of respect for Vance Joseph. That's where my disdain for Vance Joseph really came out, was that game, because Jamal Charles made one mistake and he didn't get to see the field the rest of the game. But Trevor Siemian and Isaiah McKenzie can make mistake after mistake after mistake and still come out there and do the same thing, have the same job. And at that point, that's where I really lost my confidence or my respect for Vance Joseph as a coach. And to be honest with you, you need a guy at tailback that is dynamic, that can spring off some explosive runs like Jamal Charles has showcased. C.J. Anderson's not that. He's not that guy. He really isn't that guy. He has the ability to run through people and have several big runs a game. But you need an explosive guy that's going to keep defenses guessing on what they're going to do with him, because he can hurt you in so many ways out of the backfield or obviously in the zone read concept. I just think a lot of things is the Denver Broncos have to look at tailback as another area on obviously getting rid of a couple guys. I think C.J. Anderson's going to be done. I think C.J. Anderson is not going to be a Denver Bronco next year. I think he's going to be a cap casualty, unfortunately. You know what? But the Broncos got to do a better job of really utilizing the talent that they have, and I just feel like they haven't done that a lot this year.
And And I think that's why I think running back could be a position, and I think they are officially boxing themselves in with how they handle Charles. Because if it was me, I totally would love to see Jamal Charles get re-signed, and then have the opportunity to be starter next year. But because of how everything's been handled, and maybe it's one of the reasons why you just let go of Vance and then start free with the opportunity that you're going to have a new coach and that is going to look at Jamal Charles and, um, you know, and then you just look at it and, well, I don't know. Basically, it's just the whole situation of potentially him being as a starter next year. It sounds so appealing, but everything that's unfolded, why would Jamal Charles sign here or sign back here? The only way that I think he would ever sign back here is, like I said, is that if Vance Joseph was let go, and the coaching staff, like Bill Musgrave, was shown enough patience to be given an offense to work with. And I would almost guarantee that if Kirk Cousins was here, he needs those type of skill backs. Look what he did with Chris Thompson and Capri Bibbs. Oh, by the way, who looks really good in a Washington Redskins uniform.
He did, man. What was it? He scored on. It wasn't this week, but it was the week before. He scored on a screenplay. And we've seen Capri Bibbs score on screenplays for the Denver Broncos. That was one of the only things he really did here. Obviously, scoring a screenplay against the Raiders last year in 2016 on Sunday Night Football. He had a C.J. Anderson moment. But, it's good for Capri Bibbs, man. It's good to see a tailback like him get a shot somewhere else. The whole situation, might I add, with Capri Bibbs was very similar to the one that the Broncos experienced with Lance Ball several years ago, unfortunately. But, good for Capri Bibbs. I'm happy for him. He posted on Instagram that he was coming for the Denver Broncos. He didn't really have a lot of success against Denver, but you know what? They won. Congrats to Capri Bibbs on that.
But he played pretty well.
Yeah, they ran the ball a lot better in the second half. Samaje Perine went off on the Broncos in the second half in terms of running the ball. He's a guy, in my opinion, I'm very impressed by him. The Redskins have a very good pick in him, obviously, going forward in the future. So, I think they're going to try to do whatever they can to keep Kirk Cousins. I know they have that weird situation with him where they keep trying to tag him each and every year, and I think he's at that point where he's getting frustrated with it. So, it's unfortunate, man, but the Broncos obviously have a lot to look at, and, I think, when you look at tailback as maybe a potential option, we got to look at receiver, too, especially if you get rid of a guy like Emmanuel Sanders, and Cody Latimer is going to be a restricted free agent. Benny Fowler is going to be a free agent. I think the Broncos have to keep Jordan Taylor. You have to utilize Sunshine more. Sunshine Jordan Taylor is going to be a big thing for the National Football League if he doesn't stay with the Denver Broncos. If he goes on to another team, I guarantee you he's going to have success.
Well, and I was going to say that, there's also an under-the-radar guy that, was on the shelf the entire, that I know for a fact the Denver Broncos love, and that's Carlos Henderson.
Yep. They missed him this year. They missed him big time.
So I think that, if they decide to move, and there's talk, obviously, the talks I think have intensified but not materialized to the point with Cody Latimer, but they are having contract talks with Cody Latimer, and we'll see if that ends up materializing. He's a guy that, and you disagree with me on this one about Isaiah McKenzie, but I think in some ways, I think this is why you have to show some patience with guys like Isaiah McKenzie, because of what you dealt with Cody Latimer. Here's a guy that dealt with so much his entire career, the beginning part of his career, didn't mesh well at all with the GOAT, Peyton Manning. He wasn't learning a playbook. He wasn't maybe as engaged necessarily as he should be. But then he started focusing on one area, and that one area ended up being special teams. Really kind of turned himself into a David Bruton on that special teams side, being a dynamic gunner on special teams. And then, a few years ago, he really decided to turn things around, and and really focus on his route running and become that wide receiver that the Denver Broncos saw with the University of Indiana, which was, just a really good, dynamic, high point the ball wide receiver. And I think that if there's one thing for Cody Latimer that he's shown the ability to do is high point the ball really well, and it really doesn't matter who's throwing it to him, but Cody Latimer has shown the ability to do that. And I think that for Isaiah McKenzie's case, he's so talented. He is incredibly talented and incredibly stupid in his first year. I can say that, but I think that for Isaiah McKenzie's case, and that you at least have to show some patience with the guy. And I think that what the Broncos should not have done, as incredible and dynamic as Isaiah McKenzie looked in preseason, they should never have given him the reins of punt returner at like second, third week of training camp. They should never have done that.
Well, heck, they gave him a job. It had to be the first day of training camp. They said that's his job. He's earned the right. That was Vance Joseph's first move, and at that point, when Isaiah McKenzie started having issues, I kind of knew that's where the angle was very suspicious. Is that it seemed more so that Vance Joseph and McKenzie were a little more buddy than a professional standpoint.
Right.
Now, I don't think Isaiah McKenzie, in my opinion, is going to play for the Denver Broncos ever again. Now, here's the reason why. He's Trendon Holiday. He's too short to be a wide receiver that's out there on the field to play, catching passes across the middle, deep drags. I think that's what Carlos Henderson was drafted for. I think they brought Isaiah McKenzie in to return punts, but at the least, he was the return option, not necessarily a receiving option. And teams aren't scared of him. Now, I factor in all of that, all of Isaiah McKenzie, the mistakes he's made, and then I factor in the scuffle with Chris Harris Jr. at practice. And Chris Harris said a big reason for that was these young guys don't have respect for the veterans. They don't. And I get it. I truly do believe that is a case in a scenario that the Denver Broncos were getting. I believe some of these young guys come in and they don't have any respect for the veterans. That's a big thing. I would take Chris Harris Jr.'s word over anything Isaiah McKenzie does, because
That's
Isaiah
true.
McKenzie
Yeah,
hasn't shown me anything to trust him. I just don't think he's the guy that's going to be on the Broncos roster, let alone help at the wide receiver position, let alone at the return position. Now, if anything, have him return kickoffs. Have him return kickoffs and have somebody else return punts. If you really want to see Isaiah McKenzie, see what he can do in the kick return game. The Broncos had a guy like him. Obviously Isaiah McKenzie's a lot like Trendon Holiday. But Trendon Holiday, man, it was almost the same issues. Being short, fumbles, turning over the ball. That was the big issue. We haven't seen the explosive touchdown play from McKenzie yet. We saw a lot of that with Trendon Holiday, and I think that's a big thing. But in order to return a punt for a touchdown, the first thing you got to do is learn to catch the ball. Now, I think Jordan Taylor's done a phenomenal job. And when I say phenomenal, I'm talking about flawless. This guy's come in there, and he's fielded every punt. He's even got positive yards on several punts. And that's all the Denver Broncos need. They need somebody that can field a punt. I remember that's been an issue for a couple years for the Broncos. Last year it was Jordan Norwood, and it was Khalif Raymond. This year it's Isaiah McKenzie. Well, now you don't really have that issue with Jordan Taylor back there. So there's a lot of different areas that I think that the Broncos really have to consider in terms of who to keep out there. And I don't think Isaiah McKenzie, unfortunately, is going to get another opportunity given everything that he's done and just the accumulation of continued mistakes. And we saw it against the Redskins with the catch, not getting out of bounds. And I think that right there was probably the nail in the coffin for maybe Isaiah McKenzie in Denver long term. Let's have some fun. You put on Twitter, this is Cody Roark, the host over at Locked On Broncos. Let's have some fun. You put on Twitter, I went along with it. You put on Twitter, the top five, what am I thinking? That'd be incredibly hard. That would be difficult. But you put on Twitter the top 10 Denver Broncos. I went to top 15, just because you really can't really go top 10 or even top 15, but I kind of expanded it to top 15. But what was your top 10, and kind of what was your thinking behind why you went with your top 10? So my top 10, and this generated a lot of discussion on the Twitter sphere. When I look at it on Twitter, I would have to say there was 2,062 total engagements and impressions on the tweet. That's pretty phenomenal. So my top 10 Broncos of all time, and this was very difficult to put into perspective. There were a lot of people that were left out, unfortunately, and that's a thing that is really hard about a top 10, let alone a top 15 or top 20. But I had number 10 as Floyd Little, tailback, phenomenal running back, especially during the time and era of which we lived where we were still dealing with racism. The things that he was able to overcome was unbelievable, especially as a tailback for the Denver Broncos. He definitely up there at number 10. I had Champ Bailey at number 9. Now, Champ Bailey is the best cornerback in Denver Broncos history. Now, I think Chris Harris Jr. and Aqib Talib have the opportunity to take that role. But you really can't put any over the other. Champ Bailey, though, what he did for the Denver Broncos in all of his years was unprecedented. The pick against Tom Brady in the AFC divisional game in 2005, the 99-yard, we thought it was going to be a pick six, but he got hit by Benjamin Watson, fumbled the ball out of bounds at the 1. The Denver Broncos had it on the 1 and ended up scoring. Champ Bailey is a guy that is one of the best cornerbacks in the National Football League of all time. Now, the Broncos traded Clinton Portis for him, and I'll never forget that move. A lot of people are like, why are you trading Clinton Portis, a very good tailback, a guy who once scored 5 touchdowns in a single game, for a cornerback, for a guy on defense? And Champ Bailey, literally, we talked about it for years. Champ Bailey literally shut down one side of the football field. And that is hard to do for any cornerbacks in the National Football League, especially in that modern era where he was going against guys like Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Carson Palmer from the Bengals at the time, and just whoever is the quarterback for the Raiders throughout during that time. It's unbelievable to see what Champ Bailey did. I really wanted the Broncos to win a Super Bowl for him, and they just didn't get it. And that was a very difficult part. But Chris Harris Jr. got to learn a lot behind Champ Bailey. And Chris Harris Jr., I think he wrote an article on it, I think, was it last year or 2 years ago, that he has an opportunity to be the best cornerback in Broncos history. I definitely agree with that sentiment there. Number 8, I had Carl Mecklenburg, a guy who's just fierce and mean. And kind of the duo of this guy is at number 7 is Randy Gradishar. I don't think a lot of people really take into consideration how ruthless Randy Gradishar was for the Orange Crush defense. He had 200 tackles in a season. I mean, that's almost unheard of.
Yeah.
He was just a guy, and the thing, you look at the era of National Football League, a lot of middle linebackers were verbal guys, a lot of guys that talked. Randy Gradishar never talked smack at all. He never did, and that's one thing that really impressed me about his game. But Randy Gradishar, he was a coach out there on the field. At the middle linebacker position, strong safety position, he had the ability. He was telling guys what formation that the team was coming out in, what players they're going to run. He put guys on his defense for the Orange Crush defense in position to make plays, and that's what makes Randy Gradishar a top guy at number 7. Now, obviously, Shannon Sharp at number 6, a tight end who's had obviously a lot of connections with John Elway throughout the years, Terrell Davis. During that time, we'll never forget called the National Guard because we're killing the Patriots. Shannon Sharp was a character, man, and I tell you what.
He definitely was a character.
I enjoy watching him till this day. Now, I can't stand watching his show because I can't stand Skip Bayless. I love Shannon Sharp. I miss Shannon Sharp on the NFL on CBS. It's just not the same without him or Dan Marino over there anymore, so that's tough. But number 5, Rod Smith. Now, Rod Smith, his whole entire story is super inspiring. Being a guy who was collecting welfare. He kept it in his wallet. I don't know if you ever knew that, but he kept a receipt of one of his welfare checks in his wallet, and he proceeded to ball out in the National Football League. I'll never forget his touchdown catch against the Atlanta Falcons in the Super Bowl. I'll never forget Rod Smith being the veteran guy that was here, obviously, with Jake Plummer, and then obviously Jake Cutler's rookie year and into his sophomore year. He couldn't stop battling the hip injury, unfortunately, but Rod Smith, man, he was a guy that was more ruthless. He was aggressive. He told you what route he was going to run, and he outbodied guys. And the Denver Broncos really missed a guy like him. But Demaryius Thomas, in my opinion, has the ability to be a lot like Rod Smith. Now, he's already surpassed him a little bit on a couple charts. Actually, he's behind him on a couple charts, but he passed Shannon Sharp. But Rod Smith is a guy that forever holds a special piece in Broncos country. Now, number 4, a guy who's been tragically snubbed from the Hall of Fame, as have many legendary Denver Broncos. I had Steve Atwater. Who could ever forget the hit on Christian Okoye? He gave the nightmares And I'm telling you what, Steve Atwater brought the thump on people. If you go back and watch the Super Bowl against Green Bay, Steve Atwater was everywhere. Now, I'm talking about a safety. We haven't seen a guy like Steve Atwater in the National Football League in quite some time. Number 3, I had Peyton Manning. Now, a lot of people were like, well, why do you have Peyton Manning? He spent most of his years in his career in Indianapolis. Well, Peyton Manning's 4-year stretch with the Denver Broncos was unbelievable. Well over 100 touchdown passes in just 4 years, well over 17,000 yards, 2 Super Bowl appearances, 1 Super Bowl win, playoffs every single year. Peyton Manning was a guy who changed the culture for the Denver Broncos. Von Miller, I'll never forget it, Super Bowl 50. If you watch the sound bites that mic'd up, Von Miller says, "I'm happy you're my quarterback." I almost shed a tear watching that. That gives me goosebumps every time. It just goes to show you, there was nobody in the National Football League, I don't think ever. I really don't think there's ever been a guy in the National Football League that was as cerebral as Peyton Manning. I don't even think Tom Brady's as cerebral as Peyton Manning was. Peyton Manning was attention to detail to the finest line, and he's first class. He was always a first-class competitor, and I loved it when he would chew his teammates' butts. So I'll never forget him chewing out Julius Thomas for Julius Thomas not running a route, being lazy on the route. I will never forget that. I respect that. That's what the NFL needs more of. Number 2. And this is the number 1 and number 2 can obviously easily be flip-flopped, but Terrell Davis and John Elway, top 2 Denver Broncos of all time. TD and John Elway, obviously John winning Super Bowl MVP against the Falcons. Terrell Davis winning it the year prior against Green Bay, playing through the migraines, all that. 2,000-yard rushing season, just a phenomenal player. And unfortunately for Terrell Davis, we look at, a lot of people are saying he didn't belong in the Hall of Fame. Well, I beg to differ. He absolutely did. The things that he accomplished in his career, despite the injuries he suffered in the short amount of time of his career, is unprecedented. And I think a lot of people have lost sight of what that really is in the National Football League. And so I think he deserved his Hall of Fame jacket. Now, John Elway, the Duke, the guy who, controversial early out in his career, took the Broncos to many winning seasons, obviously to the playoffs, 2 Super Bowls that, they lost, and obviously they finally got it. In his last 2 years of his career, back-to-back, won the Super Bowl. John Elway is a player who had a phenomenal arm, and when you go back and you watch John Elway in that time in the NFL, the drop back was so different. John Elway's drop back compared to how quarterbacks drop back now in the National Football League is so different, but his velocity that he had on his arm, the ability to thread the needle in between 2 guys, the game-winning drive against the Browns, unbelievable. It's the stuff like that we really don't see a lot anymore in the National Football League. And I almost, anytime the NFL Network plays some old school games, I have to tune in. I have to, because it's a different era, an era where I felt like people respected the game more, and the game didn't turn into something that was not about the game. I feel like the NFL today has evolved, unfortunately, into a state where it's not about football anymore. It's about politics. It's about platform. It's not about football. But that time right there, John Elway, Terrell Davis, Steve Atwater, Rod Smith, Shannon Sharp, Gradishar, Mecklenburg, Floyd Little, those were times where football actually meant something to a lot of people. And that's my top 10 list. Now, there are so many guys that could be out there. Obviously, Zimmerman's on my honorable mention. Al Wilson, for example, Von Miller, Tom Nalen. Who could forget Tom Nalen as well? And I'd say maybe even a guy I want to mention as an honorable mention is Darren Williams in his short career as a Denver Bronco in the National Football League before tragically losing his life. I really do feel like he had a lot of potential for the Denver Broncos. He was electric, and it's unfortunate that the Denver Broncos lost him. Now, another guy who might get an honorable mention, this might be a weird one, is Tony Scheffler. That man made so many plays for the Denver Broncos at tight end in the Jake Plummer, Jake Cutler era. I kind of miss Tony Scheffler, but he's definitely a guy in my honorable mention list. What about you, Cameron? What was your list?
Well, I had to expand it to top 15. I had one person mention me on Twitter. I said, you should do a top 15. So I had to do top. So should I go with the top 10 or should I go with the top 15 along with because the top 15 would include the honorable mention.
Heck, rock, paper, scissors, you do it, man.
I'll go top 15 Broncos. All right, so 15, and honest, I mean, you could, if you wanted to, move this guy a lot higher simply because he owns the scoring record for the Denver Broncos, and that's Jason Elam. And not a lot of people, I think, when you were looking at them filling out the top 10 or top 15, really kind of gave any consideration or even honorable mention to a guy like a Jason Elam for the kind of time that he did. And I realize it's low, but I easily could have put Steve Atwater up top, and I put Steve Atwater at 14. I mean, you can't really say enough about the guy. I mean, the guy, at least for the Broncos, set the standard of how to play safety for the Denver Broncos when he was there. He was physical. He was physical. He was versatile enough to cover a lot of the tight ends. And then when push came to shove, he would let you know about it afterwards. And I think you got to appreciate that. And this one, I mean, you can easily fluctuate. I put Chris Harris at 13. I mean, you can, obviously I would, if I was to probably do it over with, I could probably put Steve Atwater over Chris Harris or Demaryius Thomas, which I have at 13 and 12. Demaryius, and I think, and you've been seeing it on Twitter from me, but I think when all is said and done, Demaryius Thomas will in fact be the best wide receiver in Broncos history, and also the most underappreciated wide receiver in Denver Broncos history. And
Absolutely.
And I think that I really had not thought about that point until Andrew Mason brought it up on Orange and Blue 760. And when he brought that up, I spent like 3 or 4 days just literally just thinking about that. Just because the amount of criticism that he has taken, and I think in large part it has to do with the guy that drafted him. And especially the guy that was drafted, or that the guy that he was drafted ahead of. He was drafted ahead of Dez Bryant, and for the longest career, he will always be pegged, and as far as comparison and everything, to Dez Bryant.
I'd rather have Demaryius Thomas
And I would
than Dez Bryant.
absolutely at this point in the career, there was that point where I would have wanted Dez Bryant's pissed off nature in Demaryius Thomas, but the more I just started wondering about that, it's like, Demaryius Thomas, I would take his character and the type of player that he is well over the guy that Dez Bryant is, and the ability that he had to play with Tim Tebow and resurrect his career, or not resurrect, but jumpstart his career on the throw, and against the Pittsburgh Steelers, really jumpstarted his career, or jumpstarted his stardom. And then you get the chance to really refine the route running with Peyton Manning, and I think that there it just really took off. And Peyton Manning himself, people I think probably didn't think much of it, but Peyton Manning said himself that Demaryius Thomas was the most physically gifted wide receiver that he had ever played with.
Wow.
If
Reggie
I
Wayne, Marvin
if I remember
Harrison,
right,
all those
I mean,
guys. Wow.
if I remember right, I think he said that.
Well, think about it too. Demaryius Thomas in college at Georgia Tech. Guess what offense? He blocked. He ran one route a game. Think about that too. So I agree. I absolutely agree with Demaryius Thomas.
Well, and maybe I'm off base there, but I think I remember that Peyton Manning said something as far as to the point of a physically gifted wide receiver. I think Demaryius was probably the best I ever. I mean, we can look it up. I don't know, but I think I read that somewhere when he was here with the Broncos. I don't know. Maybe I'm off base. I've been off base before. I compare Paxton Lynch to Jared Goff and Carson Wentz. Anyway, so Gary Zimmerman I have at 11. I mean, he is the best tackle, best offensive lineman, really, for the Denver Broncos. And the second best is a guy that's going to have his jersey retired this weekend, is Ryan Clady. So the best offensive lineman, Gary Zimmerman, he was one of the stalwarts of arguably the best offensive line. You think about it, Gary Zimmerman was part of maybe the best offensive line in NFL history, and potentially maybe the stretch. I mean, you think about it, the mid-90s, 94 to 98, 99, who was potentially the all-Madden offensive line team throughout that. It was the Denver Broncos offensive line with Gary Zimmerman, Matt Lepsis, Mark Schlereth, Tom Tom Nalen, and so I think that everything there just spoke volumes to the type of magnitude that Gary Zimmerman had on that offensive line. Floyd Little is, you want to talk about underappreciated. Floyd Little is a guy that if you put him on the Dallas Cowboys back in the late 60s to mid 70s, he's a guy that could have been a first ballot Hall of Famer with the amount of production that he put up and the amount that could have been as far as a bullet on his back. And thinking of who he replaced at the University of Syracuse. Oh, by the way, he replaced a guy by the name of Ernie Davis.
Mm-hmm.
And Ernie Davis replaced who? Jim Brown. So it was, I think there was a target on his back, but he clearly played with a lot of chip on his shoulder. He was a bow-legged running back. He was swift when he ran with the football. He understood how to be elusive when it came to the football. He learned a lot of those traits, I think, from Ernie Davis. But he was a good running back, and I think that people were starting to really appreciate the kind of running back style that Floyd Little had, and it's great to see him in the Hall of Fame. Champ Bailey, I think that Chris Harris, like I said, has the makings to be the best corner, just the amount of versatility. I think the versatility is going to end up what does Chris Harris over Champ Bailey when all is said and done. The ability to play nickel corner and play on the outside and be a number one corner. That's, I think, what ultimately is going to set Chris Harris apart from Champ Bailey. But Champ Bailey, he arguably is maybe in the top 5, top 10 best cornerbacks of all time. And one could argue he may be the best tackling cornerback in the history of the National Football League. One of the things that I appreciated so much about Champ Bailey in his career was, and I'm starting to see it a little bit with Bradley Roby, and I can't believe I'm comparing the two right now, but I think it's in large part why I feel like Bradley Roby could have a better career than Aqib Talib, which is saying something. But I see a lot of the traits, and I don't know about you, but I see a lot of the traits in Bradley Roby that I did in Champ Bailey. A guy that is not afraid to throw his head in the ground and tackle a running back 2 yards from the line of scrimmage, or 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And he's also not afraid to make a play and make a turnover when it matters. You look at the Pittsburgh Steelers game when he was literally held and punched the ball out like Charles Tillman did, having the awareness to punch the ball out and create a turnover. So Champ Bailey did all sorts of that, when he was with the Denver Broncos, shutting a lot of people. Now, he doesn't have necessarily the shutdown corner ability that Champ Bailey had, where he would shut down a Dwayne Bowe for 0 catches an entire game. But he was the ultimate pro of a shutdown corner. And you think back on it, how beautiful of a trade that was between Clinton Portis and Champ Bailey. Oh, by the way, I put it on Twitter also that Clinton Portis, I think, at least deserves some consideration, at least in the back of people's minds. Not in top 15 or not in the top 20, but do people remember at all the 2 seasons that Clinton Portis had with the Denver Broncos? Holy crap.
Kansas City game?
1,500 yards basically in 2 seasons and about 15 touchdowns every single season, or in those 2 seasons. Holy crap.
He had 4 or 5 alone against Kansas City in the one game. He ran for over 200 yards.
Right. Next one is Von Miller. That might be a little bit high for some people, but I think when all was said and done and people said, well, where's Simon Fletcher? Well, Simon Fletcher was a great pass rusher, but, in the next 2 years, Von Miller will be owning that record. And Von Miller will be and is already, in my opinion, better than Simon Fletcher.
Yep.
And especially when you factor in, look, he's not the best, obviously, in coverage, but he still provides a lot of valuable assets in coverage. So he's at least valuable in coverage, if need be. Doesn't mean he's great at it. But when you need at least that safe bet to put him in coverage at times, you can put him in there. But he's well more dominant when you put him in there, and as a pass rush. And ultimately, you compare it, J.J. Watt, everybody else, he may have the quickest first step ever. And you think about it, he does play a lot like his idol, the guy that he played or modeled his game after, and that was Derek Thomas, a guy that was ferocious, a guy that would dip and bend better than anybody as a pass rusher and get to a quarterback and have a variety of moves. Von Miller has the best dip and first step I have ever seen. And I
they
think
call him offsides when he's really not offsides. He's just fast.
he's just
They
incredibly
can review
fast.
that.
You know, it's funny, this next guy, you're talking about how Randy Gradishar's a teddy bear but plays like an animal on the field. Same with Carl Mecklenburg. And I have both Carl Mecklenburg and Randy Gradishar together.
Yeah, Rhino.
Both of them. They played incredible. They were part of the Orange Crush defense. The Orange Crush defense that is famous now in Broncos lore. Maybe next to the Orange Rush defense that I call in 2015. It was just it provided a great dynamic. And oh, by the way, Tom Jackson was part of that crew.
Yep.
So I think Tom Jackson's kind of that unknown guy or the more forgotten guy in that linebacking core. Carl Mecklenburg and Randy Gradishar both deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. Just by what they produced on the field overall and what they meant to the team. Carl Mecklenburg was probably the sound leader of the team along with Randy Gradishar. Versatile enough to be on that outside linebacker and also on that defensive line. Incredibly versatile, which they tried to do with DeMarcus Walker, but they were idiots for doing it. But that's a side story. And then Rod Smith. Rod Smith I put at 5. Rod Smith right now is the best wide receiver. On the Denver Broncos, but Demaryius Thomas is hunting him, and he's hunting him quick. Next is Shannon Sharp, the best tight end, at least for the Denver Broncos and potentially the NFL. Although some people say Rob Gronkowski, and I don't put it past him. He was a talker, never could shut up, and he was the. I don't want to compare the two because they are very different personalities, but it was the case of, those people that just never shut up but also can back it up on the field. Back in 2014, Richard Sherman was notorious for shooting his mouth off, but backing it up with his play. Throughout his entire career, I'm not saying that Shannon Sharp was a cancer like Richard Sherman, but I'm just saying that Shannon Sharp would talk the talk and he would walk the walk. And for him, the ability to go to another team and win a Super Bowl still matters to me as far as where he is on the Broncos. So I put him on 4. You said that 1 and 2 could be fluctuated. I say that 1, 2, and 3 could be fluctuated if we're being honest. And people say, well, Peyton Manning, that's too high to put on number 1, or Terrell Davis, that's too low to put at number 3. Facts of the matter is those are the 3 most important Broncos players in my estimation. Terrell Davis, you want to talk about underappreciated. Terrell Davis was probably the more underappreciated running back to now go into the Hall of Fame. Peyton Manning, you touched on it. It's one of the reasons why I put him at number 2. He changed a culture on the team. He changed the culture on the team to a winning mentality that would gain a lot of free agents, and he did way more in the time with the Denver Broncos. He jammed so much in his time with the Denver Broncos that compared favorably to what he had with the Indianapolis Colts. 2 AFC championship games, playoffs every single year, 2 Super Bowls. He actually owns a better playoff record, a head-to-head playoff record over Tom Brady when all is said and done, ladies and gentlemen. He is 3-2 against Tom Brady. I mean, the guy was incredible. He is the smartest quarterback to ever play the game. He's a computer. And I think he has a front office or coaching side set to him if he wants to. Just like the guy that signed him and is the best quarterback in the game, and that would be John Elway, who is the face of the franchise, the Duke, the guy with the strongest arm, the guy that with incredible mobility, and a guy that has the win-at-all-cost mentality when he was a quarterback. Don't look no further than the drive. So those are my top 15. Any takeaways?
You know what? I think it's really hard to put into perspective just how many good Denver Broncos players there have been over the course of history. And like I said, I don't think even in a top 15 or a top 20, you can do it complete justice. There's always some big names out there. Al Wilson, Ian Gold, for example, and heck, even DJ Williams as an opportunity. John Lynch, we can't forget about him. Just as some different options that the Broncos may have. I like to consider Nick Ferguson a special guy up there as well. But, man, I think that's a great list. And obviously I loved when Twitter, everybody responded to mine and your tweets about our top, and they responded with their top. And that's just a good, positive discussion. I think it's a healthy discussion, a healthy debate. And, there were no negative comments whatsoever. At least I didn't receive any negative comments about my top. But you always have some people that are, oh, well, this guy should be there instead of this person. I had to deal with that with somebody saying Peyton Manning didn't deserve to be on there. And I was like, man, what Peyton Manning did in 4 years, no quarterback has ever done in a span of 4 years in his entire career.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Peyton Manning put up freak numbers. Imagine if he had the Adam Gase offense in 2015. Imagine that, if the Broncos had that offense with that defense.
They may be the best football team of all time.
Ever. The highest scoring offense in NFL history. Peyton Manning, Adam Gase-led offense in 2013. I'm sorry. That's unbelievable. That was the best offense of all time. And heck, you look at that year, you had Eric Decker, you had Wes Welker, Julius Thomas, Demaryius Thomas. All those guys had 10 touchdown receptions each. And Sean Moreno had 10 touchdown receptions.
Ran for 1,000.
For a second. Think about that. That's unbelievable to have that amount of production spread all the way across the board for a football team.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Unbelievable.
Well, Cody, hey, thank you very much, man, for your time, and we will more than certainly do this again. And it's always a pleasure having you on, talk 150% Denver Broncos, and thank you very much, man, for being a part of the show. And I look forward to being on your show, and yeah, it's just always a pleasure talking sports with you.
Hey, man, well, I appreciate you having me on, Cameron. You got a really good setup going on over here over the Cameron Parker Show. You have a lot of potential for the future. I know you talk a lot about a lot of great stuff regarding Denver sports, but, specifically when we talk, it's Denver Broncos, Denver Nuggets, whatever it may be. You have a good take on a lot of things, man. So keep pushing, keep chasing that stuff, man. I enjoy listening to your show, man, and we'll definitely do this here again, and I'll obviously have you here on Locked On Broncos here soon.
By the way, you're talking about the Nuggets. I see some Nuggets tweets from you as well. What's your take on them right now?
Man, I'm excited. You know what? I haven't been this excited about the Denver Nuggets in quite some time. Obviously, the record right now is 19-16. They win tomorrow against the Philadelphia 76ers at home in Denver. That pushes their record to 20-16, which at the last time the Denver Broncos were 20-16 at this point, they ended up going on to win 50-plus games, obviously go to the playoffs where they fell to the Golden State Warriors. That's the year the Golden State really resurged in the NBA. And that's when they really started taking over. We had Andre Iguodala as the mole of the franchise.
Right.
And I'm excited for Nuggets basketball. I think they finally found a formula offensively and defensively to be very competitive. And obviously going on the road and beating Portland on the road and then beating Golden State the next night in a back-to-back and beating a tough Utah team at home, I think that gives me a lot of good feelings, obviously, for the future for the Denver Nuggets with Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray, Gary Harris, some very talented guys that they have there. And the Denver Nuggets roster, Torrey Craig, some unknown guys. Torrey Craig is a guy that's kicking down the door in the NBA. I'm excited to see what more we can get from him. And obviously, Trey Lyles having a big year so far after being considered a questionable pickup, especially considering what Utah got for Trey Lyles. So definitely a lot of excitement for the Denver Nuggets. Now that the NFL season's almost over, I'll be tuning into the Nuggets a lot more and covering a lot of them. So I'm excited about that, man.
I got to ask real quick, though, because I am trying so hard to pinpoint who will be a better player. Because for the longest time, I compared Gary Harris to Aaron Aflalo, which isn't which isn't a bad comparison.
No, I love Aaron.
But I think that Gary Harris could be way better than Aaron Aflalo, and he's clearly proving that. But who will have the better career when all is said and done between Jamal Murray and Gary Harris? Because, something to keep in mind is Gary Harris is only 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears that the confidence is starting to get there. The consistency is now starting to get there. I'm telling you, once he gets his shot and he's consistent, there may not be a player that parallels, and I can't believe I'm saying it, Steph Curry, like Jamal freaking Blue Arrow Murray.
I think Jamal Murray and Gary Harris have the opportunity to be a lethal tandem like Klay Thompson and Stephen Curry. I really do. And defensively, Gary Harris is phenomenal. Jamal Murray is still learning. Jamal Murray is still learning defensively how to play, but his offensive production you can tell the confidence in both guys have increased as the season has progressed. And to be honest with you, the NBA should be very scared of that tandem, especially with a guy like Nikola Jokic. And when Paul Millsap returns from injury, who knows what the sky could be, what the Denver Nuggets could accomplish with a unit like that. I'm jacked, man. I'm absolutely stoked. Between the two guys, they're both very young, talented guys that I think the Nuggets are fortunate to have, and I look forward to seeing them play as the season progresses.
Absolutely. Well, hey, Cody, thanks again, and I want to get your brief talk on the Nuggets. But yeah, thanks again, man, for tuning in, and we will do it again. And maybe what we'll do is dedicate it to an entire Nuggets show, talk entirely about the Denver Nuggets.
Bam, I'm all for it, my man. You just let me know when and where, and I'm there.
All right, man. Thank you very much. Share the podcast as well. Subscribe to the Cam Parker Show on iTunes. Listen on iHeartRadio. And oh, by the way, you can also listen to us on Amazon Echo. You can talk to Amazon Echo and say, hey, I want to listen to the Cam Parker Show. And you can listen to the Cam Parker Show on Amazon Echo. For all of us, me, Cody, and the producers over at the Cam Parker Show, wink, wink, we want to thank you guys for tuning into the Cam Parker Show, and tune in again next time on Tuesday, as we will get some baseball coverage from CJ Cranock if we can. It's been a tall task trying to get him back on, but we will. With the big news of the day is the Rockies signing Wade Davis. From all of us at the Cam Parker Show, thank you very much, and you all have a great rest of your guys' night and a very safe New Year's.